these beings that we're interacting with are essentially time travelers, and their crafts are essentially possibly time machines.
Some of them, yeah. That's kind of the main idea. And you're right. So it's interesting because I got into all of this when I was very young because I had a sort of vision that popped in my head, something that sort of led me down this path. And it's funny because it's kind of the opposite of what a lot of people think. They're like, oh, how'd you get into UFOs? And it's more like, how did you get into biological anthropology? How'd you get into human evolutionary anatomy? Because this little image that popped in my head when I was 8 or 9 years old was sort of a chimpanzee-like early hominin form, a modern human, and then this archetypal, what did you call these little troll guys?
Skiff gnomes?
Skiff gnomes, yeah, with the big heads, the big eyes, the small faces. And just that question then, could they be us from the future? So I started out in physics and astronomy and then switched to biological anthropology in my sophomore year to investigate that question. Obviously, being aware of confirmation bias, selection bias. Like I just had an open mind to this question of could they be us in the future, coming back to visit and study their own hominin evolutionary past in the same way that I would as a biological anthropologist, as an anthropologist in general. I'd be interested in their culture, all of the things that don't preserve in the fossil record, to see those, the language, the social interaction, how they have sex, like all these things that don't preserve, that would be really cool to know. And you can answer all those questions with the time machine. So I get the sense based on what they're described doing in our time, some of them, obviously there's a lot of variation, and how they look too. There's variation in the form. But a lot of it is very indicative of what we as modern anthropologists would do if we had access to the same time travel technology. And we would look to them a lot like how these great aliens look to us now in our current present. If we went back even 160,000 years into the past, we have a big forehead, we have larger eyes, smaller faces, less hair on our bodies, but we still have upright walking, we still have penadactyly, we still have a tetrapod configuration, 2 gut openings, eyes, nose, mouth in the same place on our skull. So there's so many similarities that seem to indicate that they are hominins, or at least the vast majority of them are, but just at a more evolved point in our own evolutionary future. So I think it's helpful just to kind of take now and look back in the same way that we might be seeing us in the future looking back on us now.
Yeah, so your work essentially draws a straight line in comparison from where we came from, where we are, and if you draw that line out even straighter, you get pretty much exactly what these people are describing when they meet these entities.
Yeah, for the most part, I mean, again, there is a lot of variation, and we have to take that into account. As scientists, we can't just toss out outliers. Those outliers might be really important for helping us understand the breadth of this phenomenon. So, but for the most part, and I oftentimes cite the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free study where they interviewed experiencers who, for even in recent history, have kind of been pushed to the side because it's just too weird. People don't want to wrap their head around it. But these might be the best sources. This might be the best information because they had the closest form of a close encounter you can have. And what they describe based on the results of this study, the majority are human, just like us. Like that was the most commonly described as human. And I overlooked that in my first book, Identified Flying Objects, because I was solely focused on the grays, long-term evolutionary changes, overlooking the fact that a lot of people describe people who are outside the craft doing jumping jacks. They're collecting grasshoppers to study the ecosystem, also something we'd want to do in our future if we're living on the same planet. So they have kitchens, they have bathrooms, they have clothes strewn about the floor of their craft, and they look just like us. So I kind of tried to right that wrong in my second book by looking at a number of cases over about 90 years on 5 different continents to really bring in the scope of just how broad and variable this is, but also importantly, to demonstrate how many commonalities there are, how many similarities there are. And you can see these patterns reemerge over and over again from these cases. And what it seems to indicate is that they're not just us from the future, but they're us from a lot of different points in that future.
Whoa. Yeah, that would definitely fill some plot holes there. A lot of the cases, some cases which you have cited in the extraterrestrial model, which, you look at Travis Walton, where he had this encounter primarily with these beings in these orange suits that, physiologically looked a little bit more like this. I know there were some differences, but they had the larger heads. They were shorter, bigger eyes. But then throughout that, he encounters humans, or what seems to be humans at least, and they possess like great strength.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Yeah, they're like prime.
Flawless.
Yeah,
With I think he said they have like a familial connection almost, like they look like each other.
that's right.
Yeah. And again, those are things we'd expect based on another common trope throughout the phenomenon is the hybridization program. So it's important for the theory as a whole to understand that based on the biological classification of species concept, where if you have two organisms that can mate and reproduce viable offspring, they're considered the same species. Classic example is the donkey and the horse. They can make a mule, but that mule's infertile, so we consider them separate species. However, if we're reproducing with these advanced big-headed aliens, by the definition that we've established for what two species are, as the same species, they would be considered the same species. But
Right.
it's also that, that familial connection jumped out to me because you might be taking the same gametes from one individual who have certain characteristics that you've already identified in that person. That's why you took them up and extracted sperm and egg from them in the first place. And then you reuse those in other individuals. So you would expect to have that sort of sibling resemblance, maybe even twins resemblance, because you're using the same gametes to make these same hybrid individuals. So, and another thing too, like the whole walking amongst us question. You could easily create humans to fit in any time period throughout the past by taking the gametes of certain individuals at different points in that past and hybridizing them in just the right way that they would retain certain characteristics, maybe telepathic or sort of high intellect, intuitive characteristics that are indicative of the human future, which they seem to be based on these encounters, but give them the physiological characteristics of people at any time throughout the human past.
Well,
and I mean, I'm not saying that's happening. I don't have proof that any of these things are happening. I haven't seen it myself. But the whole point in writing these books was to just look at the broad degree of variation in these accounts and try to pull information from those and recognizing patterns. And that's a big thing that we do in anthropology in general, is just try to understand human variation, but also those commonalities. We have this thing that's sort of at the heart of what we do, where we're focused on cross-cultural variation over time, over space. But what's even more important to us are the commonalities, what we call cultural universals.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of examples of this, things like marriage, for instance. Like every culture throughout the world has some form of marriage. Obviously, there's a lot of difference in how we do it in different places and throughout time. An incest taboo. And these make sense if you think about them. Like, you could have people throughout any culture in the world start making babies with close relatives, and you get an increase in homozygous recessive characteristics, their negative traits, they're bad. And you go, oh, I only see these when I reproduce with my relatives. Maybe we make a rule against that. So a lot of these have sort of an innate biological origin point. But those things tell us so much about what it means to be human and about the human past and the way people organize themselves. And I feel like if we take these accounts seriously, these encounters that people have where they're actually in the presence of the beings, communicating with the beings, and we start to focus on those commonalities, those sort of abduction universals, if you will, it might give us deep insight into not just who they are, where, when they're coming from, but why they're doing what they're doing, what their intentions are, what our own future might look like based on the physiological and cultural aspects of these beings.